Okay, good morning everyone. Sorry for that delay, but welcome to our breakfast briefing webinar. My name's Callum Rees. Hopefully you can all hear me okay now. I'm the account manager at SustainIt, and this morning I'll be taking you through how to select the right CSR and EHS software. So let's go. As you can see here, the agenda for the webinar this morning, we'll be covering the following: strategy, materiality and planning, defining your requirements, the vendor demonstrations, software implementation, followed by ongoing management and support, and then hopefully, if we've got time at the end, a couple of questions. So before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. As you already know, today's webinar is only 30 minutes long, so we'll hopefully finish at 10 a.m. We've allowed about 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the presentation for questions, although you're welcome to post your questions as we go along. And as you can see here, you should be able to see this kind of dialog box to enter them in. I may not get through all of the questions, but I'll be really happy to answer anything additional after the presentation is concluded. Just one more thing, we're also recording this webinar, and within the next day or so, we'll post it on our YouTube channel, and you'll get an email with a link so you can either share it or revisit the presentation later. Okay, so just a very quick introduction to SustainIt before we start. SustainIt are a key player in global CSR data consultancy. We established in 2005, and we have over 40 years combined experience providing both managed and professional services to FTSE 100 and Fortune 500 companies. Our services include, more specifically, software support, data analysis and verification, project management and planning, software selection and implementation, sustainability strategy and target setting, which I'll touch on, and sustainability consulting. Whilst we do work with multiple software solutions and partners globally, we do remain fiercely independent. And this way we're able to offer our clients what they need rather than having to kind of sell them any particular product or system. So that was just SustainIt in a nutshell. So with timings in mind, let's move swiftly on. Okay, so the first section here relates to strategy, materiality and planning. And I want to talk briefly about a few different things here. The first is the planning. So what steps should you be considering when planning your EHS software selection journey? And the second is how to measure your sustainability strategy, as well, of course, as what else you should be considering at this stage. So in terms of project planning, as you can see on the screen, these are just the basic prerequisites of a successful project. So you need your stakeholder buy-in, you need the budget approved, and you also need the resource. So I'll go into this in a bit more detail. So in terms of buy-in, specifically from the board, aside from money, having this top-down agreement from the board to the direction you're taking will really benefit the process. In an ideal world, although we know it doesn't happen, this should extend past the sustainability team and will be driven by a business-wide culture of sustainability. Buy-in will also extend to the wider internal and external stakeholders, but I'll touch on this a bit later on. Budget is of course crucial, not only to begin the project, but to have in mind when scoping the project. So knowing your budget will help you to manage your expectations and also look at the potential configurations and enhancements. Regarding resource, specifically human resource, we found here that an enterprise EHS system requires on average 2 to 3 full-time employees in order to successfully manage the tool. And involved in this resource, you will also need to include IT, especially during the implementation, and think about ongoing requirements around the kind of reporting periods, for example. Now I'm going to touch on how to plan the project with your sustainability strategy in mind. So hopefully you have a sustainability strategy. That's great. So this may be an obvious starting point, but from our experience, many companies still rush into purchasing a system without really understanding what it is they want the system to do for them. Don't do this. After all, what's the point in having a sustainability strategy if you're not going to measure progress against it? So going into this in a bit more detail, you could look at how to measure your strategy by breaking it down into 3 sections. So you have your goals, KPIs, and you've got your metrics. So I'll just give you a simple example. The goal is energy from renewable sources equates to 80% of global energy use, not an uncommon strategy. So the KPI that sits underneath this would be the percentage of renewable energy use. That's what you need to measure. And the metrics below this would be total energy usage that you need to track, and also renewable energy usage. And of course, there's a lot more work involved in measuring this data, especially relating to things like workflows. But just planning how you can measure all aspects of your strategy at this early stage is really going to be vital going into the system implementation even. Similarly, just kind of touching on the kind of frameworks, a lot of companies do report to external frameworks or employ industry-specific indices. For example, CDP, GRI, very common, or one that's being increasingly adopted are the UN Sustainability Development Goals. So these should also be considered at this kind of early stage. Many systems will help you track progress against your goals, but also help you to complete these reporting frameworks. So this is a great time to look at it. The ability to measure your sustainability strategy will depend on not only your current but your future goals as well. So try and plan for the long term so that your system doesn't become redundant in a few years. Okay, defining your requirements. So now that you've looked at your strategy and you've planned your project, you're now in a great position to look at this. So remember, it's good to, as I just mentioned, not only think about your current requirements, but also what you may want from the system in the future. I think it's worth noting at this point as well that it's best to start small and kind of scale upwards. So if you speak to most major companies or a good portion of them who have been through a similar exercise, they'll probably tell you this. This is because large EHS systems can require a big change management process. Also, another thing, just don't rush into the demos before you do this. So many systems offer really great functionality, getting better all the time, as well as becoming increasingly pretty or sleek. But of course, they all have their own strengths, weaknesses, and pricing strategies. Obviously, if the vendor fully understands what you want to achieve, then they'll be much better able to showcase what's important to you during the demos, and of course beyond. The way we encourage our clients to go about this process is to produce a requirement specification. This is just a simple Word document, and then we kind of ask the various vendors to respond to this. So this can be split into both functional but also technical requirements. So some quick examples then of the functional requirements. So we've got data collection and requirements that fall under that, reporting and dashboards, the data verification, how that might look within the system, and of course a more general one, and data management. So as I've just mentioned, another thing that's really important here is to look at your technical requirements as well. So I'll repeat again, please include IT in this process. Some things that you might need to think about within the technical requirements would be the system security, what integrations you may need both now and in the future, and also the general system architecture. So once you've done this, the next step is to score the vendor responses. So what we like to do with some of our clients is use a weighting system. We find this is an effective way to evaluate the responses that the vendors give, and highlight how effective each software is at meeting your most important requirements. And also here, it's kind of good practice to make sure that you understand the level of customization or configuration needed to realize these requirements, and maybe scale back in some areas if you need to, because customization is really tempting, but will definitely add considerable costs to the build of your system. So as I've already said, it's kind of often a good idea to start with something fairly out of the box, and then you can customize and develop your relationship with the vendor as you go. Okay, so the fun part begins, the system demonstrations. So following the analysis of the vendor responses to the requirement spec, you should have a decent idea now on what each vendor can do. But of course, the proof is in the pudding. So we recommend that 2 to 3 demos should be sufficient at this stage. We would also always advise communicating with your shortlisted vendors prior to these demonstrations. So for instance, a high-level agenda can be helpful by listing the key functions or your must-haves. The vendor will be in a much better position to show what their software is capable of, rather than kind of pinpointing the bits that they're good at. So in regard to logistics, realistically, unless you're in the market for a very large global enterprise piece of software, we'd recommend no more than 1.5 hour demonstrations with 30 minutes of questions. So you're kind of looking at 25 to 35% of the overall time for questions, because once you've gone through this kind of planning and requirement stage, you should already kind of have some of these in place anyway. And again, I'll say it in every slide, when you're defining the requirements, unless the IT team are driving the project, make sure to have a technical lead here as well, especially in the questions side of things. Because this project is, after all, a technical system, and oftentimes the sustainability team will lack these capabilities. It's also a good idea, just one last thing here, it's also a good idea to provide the vendors with real-life data that they could use in the demo. They can then build a kind of bespoke demo environment that will really help you to visualize how the system can work for you. Okay, so you've chosen your system. Now you're on to the software implementation. I'll come back to this slide in a second. So let's firstly look at some of these figures. Okay, so as you can see here, we've taken these findings from NEAM's 2017 EHS and Sustainability Software Bias Guide. The top figure there, 195,000. This was the average budget of all of the respondents of the survey, but then the figure below is the real life cost of the implementation. So it's a good kind of 25 to 30% higher than what they budgeted. And then when you also look at the time taken, 12 months. So we found this as well. The average amount of time taken for the whole implementation cycle is about a year. So probably a bit longer than you might expect. Okay, so back to this slide. Just going to look briefly at some of the basic steps. So during your implementation, the communication between the IT and the software provider is crucial. So the system design, and it may sound obvious, but the system should be designed according to the original requirement specification and strategy. Try not to let the scope creep too much. The system build and configuration, this is where you'll actually start building your brilliant relationship with your selected vendor, hopefully. So this should be an iterative process. Avoid a kind of big bang approach, one large system build. So it kind of needs to be configure, test, and so on. And also this configuration process should definitely be reviewed against any predefined acceptance criteria and quality standards. So hopefully you've kind of got a project manager in place for these aspects. The migration of data, so migrating your historical data to the new system will make sure that all of your kind of data is in one location going forward. But it'll also act as, it will help to form the kind of benchmarks for any future inputted data as well. And it's also important to kind of test during this process. Test all levels of data here just to make sure it really kind of translates into the new system. And as I've just already kind of mentioned there, testing should be done at all stages of the software. Make sure it's iterative, bit by bit, so that you're not left with any kind of large problems just before you wish to go live. So I'll touch on the kind of training in a bit more detail in a second. Okay, so as I've already touched on, unlike maybe some other software purchases, some smaller systems, your sustainability software is likely to be a living system that will kind of evolve over its lifespan. And because you've already spent time to not only think about but communicate to the vendor your future requirements, you should already have rough estimates of any future configuration or integration costs, but also kind of good understanding of new capabilities of your chosen software. Do speak to them about the kind of roadmap, where their system's going at the kind of pre-planning stage as well. So depending on how big the system is, it generally takes, like we just said, 12 months to implement, but also it will take another 12 months, on average, for the system to become part of users' everyday routine. So to help put you ahead of the curve here, two important things should be considered. First one is training, and second is engagement. So training will apply to both the low-level users, those inputting the data into the system, but of course the system administrators or the kind of master users of the system. Obviously, training your staff on how to use the software is just as crucial as selecting the right software, as there's no real point in having a smooth and intelligent data management tool if no one knows how to use it. So that is really key. And then engagement is also a massive one. So engagement with users as well as stakeholders, and use the reporting functionality as it's intended. So data needs to flow out as well as in. Don't allow your system to become a kind of black hole where people are inputting data and they don't really understand why. You need to kind of communicate the benefits and the progress against the goals to what you're doing. So engagement is really key. And also employees tend to want to work for companies that take a proactive stance when it comes to environmental sustainability, for example. So yeah, just share this with them. So having employees understand why they're inputting this data will also improve the rate of use, and thus improve the kind of timeliness, but also the accuracy of the data going into the system. As I mentioned in the planning slide, I think it was, you'll need to allow for enough resource to manage the system ongoing. So at this stage, you also need to take into account the following. So kind of increased workload during reporting periods. The build up to these deadlines can get very busy. So plan your resource accordingly. Also take into account the number of expected users. Obviously, the more complicated, but also more data you'll get, and the better you'll be, the better position you'll be in with your system, and also the reporting side of things. And maybe consider the kind of use of external consultants to manage this system if you don't have the resource, especially around these kind of busy reporting periods. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too much information. So I'll just kind of give you a recap before I answer any questions at the end. The first one, communication. Communication is very vital, especially with large systems. You really need to understand a completely new system, and your vendor also needs to understand both your processes and your requirements. So it's a two-way communication. Next one is current and future. So think long term. So this goes for the planning, but also the requirements of the system. Any reporting that you might, reporting frameworks that you might be looking towards, but you're not quite doing. Just consider everything that, even in the next 5 years that you might be doing at this stage. Involve IT. If I haven't said it enough, this is an IT system, but you really would be surprised at the low level of IT involvement that we've seen and heard about. And then, as I just touched on in the last slide, engagement and training are both essential. So users need to be able to use the system and understand its importance to the company. The board, as well as other stakeholders, need to be in the know. Okay, so that's all I have to say. So thank you very much for listening this morning. And now hopefully I have enough time to answer a couple of questions that you've been asking during the webinar. And I do. Okay. Okay, so the first question, I won't name any names. I struggle to engage my users or also the team with using software. In your experience, what's the best way to get them involved? Thank you very much for the question. So I'll give you a few examples of exactly how you can improve engagement. But the key point here really, I think, is to involve everyone as early as possible. Obviously, certain employees will kind of be the core team for the system, and these guys should be included in as much of the selection process as possible. This is really most important when you're going through the writing of the requirement specification, as this is the kind of point where stakeholders can have a real input as to what they want from the software. In terms of wider engagement quickly, just make sure you communicate via the general and usual routes. So emails, if you have an intranet, utilize this. Meetings or even focus groups, and that kind of goes back to the kind of requirement specification. So if you're kind of listening to various people who are dealing with your environmental or your health and safety data, these are the guys that really know where the pitfalls are in your current processes and also what they would like to see. And then it's just a case of kind of translating that into the kind of RFP process with the vendors. Okay, so I think we have another question. I chose the wrong software. What now? Okay, well, of course, this is something we commonly see at Sustain It. And again, I touched on that kind of NEAMS report. They're a really good resource for looking at some of these CSR systems. So I would definitely check those guys out if you're not aware of them already. So we actually have a client going through this process at the moment. So as you've learned this morning, if you didn't already know this, changing software is really long and time-consuming process. So the first thing I would do is to see if the software that you have can just be adapted to meet your needs. So step one, of course, would be to maybe redefine your requirements and then speak to the vendor about how they can meet these and just be really open with them because obviously once you are a client, they'll be inclined to keep you as a client. Therefore, the cost may be reduced. So just kind of try and communicate. But if you really do just want to move, maybe because you don't have a good relationship with a vendor or you just know for a fact that there's other systems that will better meet your needs, then hopefully I've outlined the process in this webinar well enough on kind of what you should do when looking elsewhere. But please do get in touch if you'd like to talk through anything more specifically. Okay. Yeah, as I just said, if you do wish to kind of continue the conversation with myself or a member of Sustain It, please do get in touch via email. So you can see my email there and then also the generic one and our website just below. I'd also like to remind you that this webinar will be published on our YouTube channel. So just search for Sustain It in YouTube and you'll find this presentation along with all of our earlier webinars. So if you really enjoyed it, then you can just kind of binge watch Sustain It webinars. So yeah, it just really remains for me to say thank you very much for joining us today. and goodbye from all of us here at Sustain It, and have a good day.